Good afternoon. I'm Steve Schmidt with The Warning, and I am delighted today to be joined by one of the preeminent investigative journalists in the English-speaking world, Vicky Ward of Vicky Ward Investigates, and she is the author of a book about a terrible story that has been in the news now for years. There is a new Netflix documentary out about it. And of course, I'm talking about the title of her book, appropriately focused on the victims, the Idaho 4, the terrible murders committed by Brian Kroberger in town of Moscow, Idaho, a bucolic university town in the reddest of red states. And the book is about all of the schisms in our society. We'll also talk this afternoon a little bit about Jeffrey Epstein because Vicky Ward has investigated that case. And when we talk about class in America, when you talk about power in America, when you talk about accountability in America, it seems that Jeffrey Epstein's hand keeps reaching up from the grave. And so as we get the conversation started, Vicky, what is at the core, what drew you to this case that makes you want to go so deep into such a very, very dark story?
This one is the Koberger story,
Yeah.
right? The Idaho 4. Well, you're right, Steve. It's a big departure for me. I normally look at corruption and power and money, and this is very different. I was wrapping up a podcast series about the Federalist Society called Pipeline to Power. It's about the ties between Yale Law School, which most people think of as very progressive, but it's about the ties between Yale Law School and the Supreme Court on the conservative side. And it was very, very interesting, but it took me a very long time. I'd spent 2 years thinking about originalism and sort of wonky constitutional legal theory. And I'm the mum of twin sons who are now 22. In November of 2022, when the murders happened, they were both in college. And so there was something about the photograph of the 4 victims in Moscow, Idaho, these beautiful 4 college kids that really just stayed with me because these kids were so ordinary. They could have been any of our kids. And I kind of couldn't get that photograph out of my head. And as my kids then came home for Thanksgiving and later then for Christmas, and they still had no clue who had done this unspeakable thing, I kept wondering about those kids' families. I was also very drawn by the pictures of the news of Moscow, this little town in Idaho I'd never heard of, but as you said, incredibly bucolic, picture perfect, small American town, jarringly at odds with the tragedy, really, of what had happened. And then when they arrested on the other side of the country in Pennsylvania, much closer to where I live in New York, this criminology PhD student, something about the fact that he was also a college student was interesting to me. And I did wonder, I'm the mother of young adult sons, what it was that could have driven him, someone who had overcome heroin addiction as a teenager and obviously overcome considerable sort of personal difficulty, to then get into a PhD program at a prestigious university, Washington State University, and then go out, blow it all up and go out and commit these unspeakable crimes. There was something about that. And it felt in contrast to thinking about the Supreme Court. It felt very gritty and very real and very tangible. And I was sort of mulling all this aloud. I've worked with James Patterson before on podcasts, funny enough, on Epstein related podcasts. And he phoned me up and said, I hear you're interested in writing a book about these murders, and something about them, he said, spoke to him as well. And we both agreed that there's something about it felt reminiscent of In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, which is, I think, a book that had both left a searing impression on both of us. And we agreed that if we were going to do this, we were going to write a book that would feel personal. It would feel emotional. We wanted readers to know the four victims, Maddie, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan. We wanted the readers to feel what the day-to-day of their lives were like, what their different personalities were. And we wanted readers to feel like they were there in Moscow when these murders happened. And we wanted readers to sort of feel the awful ripple effect that happens when something like this happens, and how the friends and the families are affected, yes, but also how the coroner is affected, the police chief, the mayor, the local journalist, people sort of maybe 6 degrees away. I mean, in this case, one of the local business owners almost went bust because of the true crime mania that developed in the wake of the murders. There was all this online speculation. And we get into that, just how harmful this was. We get into the fact that there was a political divide in the town at the time of the murders. This is a liberal college town, but there is a conservative church in Moscow which has 4,000 members. The town has only got a population of 24,000. The church is very rich. It's buying up a lot of Main Street. Its leader, who is, talks a lot for the book, its stated mission is to evangelize this town. And at the time of the murders, lawsuits were flying between the church and the police and civic leaders, because various arrests had been made of church members during COVID because they'd refused to wear masks, and other reasons. So it was very helpful for the church politically when the police appeared in the eyes of the American media to look like the Keystone Cops for 6 weeks, when the police initially said nothing after these murders had happened. And then there was a drumbeat of criticism online and elsewhere. Like, why are they saying nothing? There could be a murderer roaming around. This played into the hands of the church, who thought, well, it could be very, very helpful for us if the police screw up. So that, there is all of this in the book. It's not just about a terrible crime that happens in the middle of the night, but it is about that too.
When you think about what happened there in this college town, and you think about those 4 kids, and you go into a story like this, how do you reconcile yourself to facing the evil that manifests and stares back at you? How do you process the event and the human being who committed the act, and the motivation, which remains, I don't know, what word would you use? Nebulous at best.
Yeah.
How do you think about that presence of evil? And as you cover this, you are bringing it close to you
Mm.
in a lot of different ways. Talk about that.
That's a really, really great question. So it's a balancing act for me, in that the sort of forensic detective inside of my brain and personality wants to find the answers. I want to piece the jigsaw puzzle together. I mean, I think that, one of the things that drives me to write the pieces I write the books I write, is I'm looking to make sense of things, and often you can't. And so it's about, I have to balance my curiosity and wanting to understand, and hoping that by going out and getting as much understanding as I can about Brian Koberger, that there will be something in that that is revelatory and helpful and tells us something about the broader cultural moment that we are in. And I do think that his story, just the bits we do know, are helpful in that regard. I knew nothing about the quote unquote incel movement, the involuntary celibate movement that a lot of antisocial young men stuck on their phones who've been rejected by women increasingly are very familiar with. My sons know all about the incel movement. I didn't. So I think, it was helpful for me, at least, and I suspect for many other people, maybe of my age, who don't know anything about it, to understand at least what the forces are on the internet that our kids are being exposed to.
So what is an incel?
So an incel is the colloquial term for an involuntary celibate, and they're, in the last 10 years or more, accelerated by COVID, there are a large number of disaffected men, young men, whose physical interactions with women is possibly negligible. And, again, partly to do with COVID, but also partly to do with, the way human behavior has changed given our reliance on technology and social media. I mean, people don't physically go out in the way they maybe did 30 years ago, because you meet people on your phone and you get rejected having not actually moved from your desk. And there is a large growing movement among young men who've never had sex with a woman, possibly never even touched a woman. They tend to congregate on the sort of dark corners of the internet.
I don't want to interrupt you, but I want to understand this a little more deeply, and I just want to back up 2 steps to something you said, which is, I immediately go in my head to the physical world of some young guy walking up to a young woman, and being rejected. But that's not what this is. What you
No,
said is, this is somebody who is sitting isolated to begin with, trying to make a digital connection through the means by which young people meet, which is online, and they are perpetually rejected through whatever that digital persona is, whatever their image is, whatever their words is, however they present themselves to the world. And that connection, that ability to step outside of that isolation, is denied them for whatever reason. Did I describe that accurately?
you did. And then
Okay.
what happens is, to people, to a lot of these isolated, typically antisocial young men, I mean, that when they do, then, I mean, Brian Koberg did try to then go to a bar once or twice, and it didn't go well. So he retreats back into his own world, of the internet and him. But you're right that most of the rejection is experienced virtually. And so so when I sort of traced his childhood, teenage years, young adulthood, that was it. You asked me, that was interesting for me to learn. I was interested to learn that he had been exposed to this video when he was a undergraduate, when he was doing his master's degree, actually, in psychology at DeSales University in Pennsylvania. I was interested to learn that he'd watched these videos made by this guy, Elliot Rodger, who in 2014 was a college student on the West Coast out in Santa Barbara, and who had also been rejected, never had sex with women, was a sort of social outcast. And Elliot Rodger had written a memoir of his sad life, and he'd made these videos. He was a privileged kid sitting in his BMW with the sun setting behind him in the Santa Barbara hills, saying that he was now going to go out and take his revenge on the sorority women who'd rejected him. And he sent this video to his therapist, who sent it to his mother minutes before he went out and killed a large number of people, injured others, and finally killed himself. This was something that Bryan Kohberger knew all about, and that his fellow classmates talked to me about. And he was also,
and that's 2014, 15,
14. And I only bring it up because, Steve, you're right. We don't know. The police looked very hard for Kohberger's motive. He had wiped his digital footprint clean. So they were left guessing. But James Fry, the police chief, did say to me that, recently, or after the book came out and when the gag order around this case was lifted, that he was frustrated by the lack of transparency from Washington State University, which is where Bryan Kohberger goes for his PhD. And had this case gone to trial, the victims' families had all told me they really wanted to know what the red flags were in Kohberger's behavior on the campus of Washington State University, because that has remained a black box. And in the book, I think we do lift a veil on some of that. And you do see that by the time he gets there, he is a full-blown misogynist. And that is why, and it's his heinous views of women and his treatment of women that lead him to blow up the funding of his PhD. He's got a teaching position, which is how he's able to pay for his PhD. And by the time the murders happen, he has been called in before the administration at Washington State University so often that, it's clear he's about to be fired. And this is all because of the way he speaks to women. And interrupts them, he grades them poorly, but he also follows one of them out to her car, creeping her out. And he's there's this scene in the book where a guy who's in his class, they call it a cohort, makes the mistake of getting a lift from Kohberger, and Kohberger vents to him in the car about women and says, I could have any woman I want. If I walked into a bar or any social gathering, I could pick up any woman, do what I want with her. And he then goes on to say that he believes, he has a 1970s sort of view of what women's role should be in the world, that women belong in the bedroom and the kitchen. They have no business in his mind doing college degrees. And so, this classmate of his listens to all of this with increasing kind of horror. And by the week before the murders, this same classmate, a guy called Ben Roberts, is so troubled by Koberger's appearance. It's so clear to him that the guy there's something terribly wrong, that he starts to type out what they call a care form that is supposed to go to the administration anonymously. And, tragically, he looks up at Koberger again and he thinks, there's something so off about this guy that if he ever finds out it's me who's sending in this form, there could be trouble. That's something I don't need. So he deletes it and doesn't send it. Which obviously, given what Koberger then went out and did in Moscow, is very troubling. But I bring up the Elliot-Rodger comparison. We don't know that they are connected, but there are parallels that are at least interesting. Elliot-Rodger in 2014 went back and forth between two college towns in one and Isla Vista. We're going, and Elliot-Rodger in his book, and Brian Koberger lived in Pullman in Washington State, where Washington State University is, which is a 10-minute drive from Moscow, Idaho. So there's that similarity. There is also the fact that Elliot-Rodger wrote in his book that a woman he was specifically had in mind, she wasn't in the end one of his victims, was a childhood friend called Maddie. And one of Koberger's victims was Maddie Mogen, whose nickname was Maddie. And most of the families of all four victims and the friends believe that Maddie Mogen was actually Koberger's intended target, not the other three, because it was her bedroom that he went to on the night of the murders. He would have had no way of knowing that he would find her best friend there with her, because she had already left the house days before, and she was only happened to be there by complete chance. And it was Maddie Mogen's bedroom. You could see from the road if you parked your car at the back of the house, which is what the police believe that he did 12 times between August and the night of the murders. And you could see Maddie Mogen through the window, putting on her makeup or curling her hair, and anyone would have known it was her room because her name, Maddie, was spelled out in the window. So those are the parallels. But you're right when your original question, what's it like confronting this darkness? And there are definitely moments where I have had sleepless nights thinking about the evil, and also I'm a mum, and there sometimes, just because I'm interested in something, I'm always conscious I don't want to bring trouble on anyone else in my family. That's something to think about. But I also think that, as often happens when you start digging in a story about really bad people, I think Brian Koberger is unmitigated evil in a way I'm not sure I've ever seen before, actually. But the flip side of that is that I think the book shows the very worst of humanity. I also think it shows the best of humanity. And I did find that the people of Moscow, were extraordinarily welcoming to me. The victims' families really took me in. I went and stayed with the family of Ethan Chapin at their home in Priest Lake. The victims' friends, particularly the young couple who found the bodies that awful morning, sort of became like surrogate children to me. I mean, what they couldn't unsee what they'd seen, and their bravery and resilience touched me. And I think those are the reasons, in the end, you keep going. And it's as important to show that as it is to show the evil. Does that make sense?
It does. Is there any connection that you're aware of between Roger in Santa Barbara and the Columbine shootings? There is an enormous body of work that links that original school shooting, not original, but the preeminent school shooting of the era, let's say, to dozens and dozens of mass killings where those Columbine shooters had been fetishized by a later mass killing. And I wondered if you had any awareness, if there was any connection between Roger and the Columbine killers and any type of adoration, any
Well,
type of followership on that connection.
well, we do know that there are people. In fact, you said to me you're in Toronto. There was a Toronto killing in 2019 that was explicitly a copycat of Elliot Roger, quite explicitly. Columbine, I don't know if it's explicit, but it's a question that is definitely in the minds. Certainly, I know of the Gonzalez family, the family of Kaylee Gonzalez. And it's something that I would like to do more research into. I'm actually going to have dinner next week with Catherine Ramsland, the criminologist, who is the professor who showed the Elliot Roger video to Koberger. She's got to be very careful about what she can say to me about Koberger because of FERPA restrictions, but she can talk to me more generally about Elliot Roger and about all the other murderers that she taught her class about. So that's something that I'm, want to look into more.
If you sat down with Koberger, what would you ask him?
Well, the obvious question is why, but I wonder, is this actually what he wanted? I have to feel that it was performative, that what he did. I mean, having now gone to the Poconos, seen where he grew up, got to know the mother of his only friend, who sadly died of a drug overdose in 2021. There is no doubt that he has catapulted himself from a lonely life of hardship and obscurity to now he's a household name. And what I do know about his teenage years suggests to me he's a deeply manipulative, clever individual. I mean, I say that, there's in the book, there's this scene where he phones up his best friend's mother when his best friend has been arrested. They both become heroin addicts. His best friend, Jeremy, has been arrested for the first time for drugs possession and is in jail. And Koberger phones out the mother and says, "I'm so sorry, when are you going to see him? I'd like to come too." So she tells him, "Well, we're going tomorrow at 11, whatever time." And she and her husband arrive at the jail. There's no sign of Koberger, but when they get back to her house, they can see they've been burgled, they've been robbed. And she knows immediately who it is. So Koberger used, and years later, when he's in rehab, he appears in her kitchen to apologize, which she understands is one of the steps atonement. They ask you to take it in rehab. But I mean, he was a very, he thought this through. I mean, and were it not for the knife sheath, one mistake, he might well have got away with this, actually. Right. So there is a so I think I want to know if this was all, this was what he wanted. I mean, and the fear that the Gonsalves family has, and the reason they didn't want a plea deal, and have been vocally upset about that and would have preferred to see this go to trial, is that their fear is, yes, he's now locked up in jail without parole for the rest of his life, but he still has the possibility of telling his story, which gives him the power of controlling the narrative. And their gut instinct, and I suspect they're right, is that that's what he wanted all along. I mean, this has given him a platform and a spotlight that he never had. And so I think, I feel very sorry for the Gonsalves family. I do understand their concerns. I mean, there would have been issues had this thing gone to trial. There's always a risk that their trials don't necessarily go the way people expect. And there would have been years and years of appeals, or, had he been convicted. I mean, but I do understand that their worry is that now, in the current situation, he has the ability to regain control of the story of what happened to their daughter, and that's a horrifying thought to them.
No doubt. This has been such a difficult story. In part, you've referenced having kids. I have a 22-year-old college-aged Maddie. So this is a story that I have the deepest aversion to, from the, for the obvious reason. It's a horror that you don't want to think about, contemplate, go there at any conceivable level. But this is a real life nightmare, and you have had the courage to look into it, to cover it, to seek out the truth around it, and to report on it with James Patterson. And the book is called The Idaho Four. We're with Vicky Ward Investigates. And I wanted to ask you if you had a sense of the journey down the rabbit hole, through the looking glass, the portal, stepping through the hatch, across the broom, through the doorway, however you want to think about it, of a lonely boy who finds that first thread and is welcomed into incel culture. Is that a way to think about it?
Yeah.
Is it a community of incels? And how
yes.
how do, if you're in the incel community, in the way that I like going fishing, and when I feel that bite on the line, right, and I pull up the fishing pole, right? What how does somebody from the incel community know when they have a bite on the line and they're pulling it up?
Well, I think typically when, when somebody is lonely and they go online and they find that other people are lonely too, and it spirals, and that loneliness very quickly. And again, you're talking with young minds that haven't necessarily yet got fully formed perspective on the world, and that can very quickly that sense of finding a community, it's easy to then get revved up, where it's so great to find a friend that you go along with a friend who says, yeah, and by the way, don't women suck? And it's almost like you're in before you even know that you're in. Does that make sense? And, um, this is, I mean, I will say that, I've been very glad to talk to both my sons, um, in an open way. I mean, some of the hardest stuff was, along the way writing the book. One of them in particular would send me, hey, mom, saw this online. You might want to take a look at it. And some of the material I couldn't watch for more than 30 seconds. That were deeply upsetting. But I'm glad that at least, both my sons have had girlfriends. I mean, it's a false equivalence. But I'm very glad I've been able to have that conversation. And it's opened my eyes, I think, to just how lonely a lot of kids are these days, and how, as parents and as teachers, in a way, we need to be as vigilant about that as we are about someone not doing well in school.
Does the rage lie latent within this young man? Is it there as a foundation of character and gets turned on somehow? Is it something that comes from without and finds its way inside of him? Where does that rage come from? Do you have any sense of that, including just the simplest explanation is that he's evil, which is something that, and I don't mean that in any type of religious way. I mean it in a definitional way, that, and we don't really talk about it in a society very much, but that he's just evil. He's a killer. And he, like some type of predator, found his way on that day, or is it more complex than that? Do you have any sense of that? Because he is, like you said, retained the control and the power of his own
Yeah.
story
So
through all of it.
Koberger, yeah. So I want to be very clear. When I talked to you earlier on, I mean, I was talking in general about lonely guys. I mean, I think Koberger may have been lonely, but um, everyone, everyone who was in court for his sentencing that I've spoken to, including the police chief and the Gonzalez family, have said that they've never seen someone as untouched by what was an incredibly raw and broad display of, raw emotion. And for him to sit there seemingly utterly dispassionate and removed from the entire thing was, I mean, the police chief used the word evil to me. That no empathy, no connective tissue to the rest of the human race at all. And the roots of that, maybe loneliness is undoubtedly one factor, but that goes beyond, I think, that goes beyond emotions that most of us can understand. I mean, he's in a place that I don't think you or I or most people can even get to, and wouldn't want to.
Again, the book is the Idaho 4, about the murders that took place, committed against these 4 young people, um, by this animal. Um, Had that been the first time you were to that part of the United States when you went there to cover this?
Yep. I had not been, I had not been to the Pacific Northwest. I'd never heard of Moscow, Idaho. I'm pretty sure I hadn't been to Washington State. I had been to Seattle, so one of the families had a home in Lacona, but I hadn't spent much time there. Not been to Boise. I mean, and I will say that I did fall in love with the people of Moscow. I mean, by the end of it, there's a sweepstake in the town that, perhaps I'll go back one day and join the Moscow Police Department uh, as a detective, which I would very much like to do. But I have a few other things. I have another book and stuff that I need. I have a few other things taking up my time in New York right now. But it was, that was the upside of all of this. And I really hope that the readers of the book, get that. I think you do. I think you fall in love with the Idaho 4. You fall in love with the victims. You fall in love with their friends, their families, and Jim and I, James Patterson. We don't. Our job is just to tell the story and to tell their stories. We're not here to sit in judgment on anyone. It's a story about real people and experiencing real emotions when something unfathomable happens. And I think that's why the book has been very successful. It clearly does touch a chord in people, which is what we hope. But it's because you see the resilience and the love as well as the inexplicable evil.
You referenced at the beginning that for you and James Patterson, you're a North Star. Here was Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. The one of the people that I know who has read this book last night also compared it to the Joe McGinnis book, Fatal Vision, about the Fort Bragg murders
Yeah,
committed by Dr. Jeffrey McDonald
I've read that book.
back in 1970, and that there's so much unknown even to this day around why. And, part of adult life in our very expedient culture is coming to the acceptance that sometimes there is no answer to that question of why. But when we look out at what's going on in the country, he is not the only monster that walks amongst us. Another is a federal inmate who's incarcerated that you're familiar with, a privileged subject of His Majesty, a privileged daughter of a British publisher who becomes Jeffrey Epstein's accomplice, his procurer of girls. And Ghislaine Maxwell is getting ready, from my reading of the situation, to walk out of federal prison by the hand of the President of the United States of America. How do you wrap your head around that?
Well, I wish I could tell you I was more surprised. And yet I'm not, right? This entire story from the get-go has been about how soft power works, how money and power and connections can buy justice. I mean, from the get-go, that was Jeffrey Epstein's story. You could argue to a certain degree it was also, even before you get to Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, got away in his lifetime with a huge amount. It was only when he was discovered dead in the water in murky circumstances that it emerged his wealth was a mirage. He had stolen nearly $1 billion from the pension funds of his employees. So now that you have this extraordinary situation where Jeffrey Epstein died in strange circumstances, never paid the price for his sex crimes, then Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted of being his procurer and accomplice. Now, I mean, it almost feels like it's just been a waiting game from her perspective, right? The clock has ticked on, and now she holds all the cards. She has the leverage over Donald Trump. He's got politically to give his base something. We know that she sat there for 2 days and gave Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche 100 names. And very swiftly on the heels of that, she's been moved to a cushy prison. So, I mean, now it's I mean, you can sort of sit back and how this plays out. Something that will be politically useful to Donald Trump will be rolled out that she's given him, and she will, but she, she's a very, very clever person, and she'll have done a deal. I mean, she's not going to have handed him information that will save his skin politically without having done a deal to save her skin. So, I mean, I'm just expecting that at some point, I'll wake up one morning and she'll have left the country and have been sent back to either France or England, or he'll commute a sentence, or there'll be something. And the victims will completely justifiably be stunned, shocked, appalled, and a mockery will have been made of the United States justice system, and life goes on.
Is that the end of it then? Is that it? Is it at the life?
Well, I think it will be interesting
Online that, because the proposition, right, is that they just got away with it. Because the final chapter will have been her. It won't just be that she's released. She'll be asserted to be by the chief law enforcement officers of the country to be a victim when she's a child sex trafficker.
Well, that is very, very problematic, for obvious reasons. She wasn't a victim. I mean, it's a sad life story. I mean, I've said this, that a grown woman at the age of 30 whose rich father dies in murky circumstances, turns out he's a crook. And so she's no longer rich, but she nonetheless has an Oxford degree, speaks many languages, has her father's Rolodex of world leaders around the world. The idea, it's sad that somebody like that doesn't think, oh, this is, tragic, but I can build a life for myself and a career for myself with all these extraordinary privileges and tools. Instead, she thinks, I'm now dependent on a different man. I'm now dependent on this guy, Jeffrey Epstein, who's looking after me financially. So what do I need to do to continue getting a paycheck from him and continue and make myself indispensable to him? And the answer is bringing him children to traffic and abuse. I mean, that's just, that's not a victim. So, I mean, I think The story, I don't think the story ends, and I'll tell you why. Because the questions about who, I think the scale of this is so enormous that one or two names alone won't do it. We don't know. I mean, the source of Jeffrey Epstein's wealth is so opaque at this moment. And the money is the source of the power. And why did all these wealthy, unnamed people want to give so much money to a guy with no credentials? What was the hold over them? I mean, you're talking about such an enormous amount of money. You're talking about so many international connections that, I don't think a couple of names rolled out by the Justice Department is going to sufficiently answer the questions that people have about Jeffrey Epstein. So actually, my worry is almost not dissimilar from the same that the Gonzalez family has about Brian Koberger, that in a sense, Ghislaine Maxwell has now got the power. She's able to tell the story that everyone wants to hear. But at what cost? At the cost of making an absolute mockery of the United States Justice Department.
I've told the story before, both in writing and on morning podcasts, about a man named Avner Less, and he was a German Jew who becomes an Israeli police captain, and he is the man who interrogates Adolf Eichmann for 275 hours, doesn't talk about the experience really for 20 years, and then is asked a question about, did you have a takeaway from it? And he says, yeah, I did. My takeaway was that there are Adolf Eichmanns everywhere. They're all around us, but they're latent and harmless in democracies, but become deadly in an instant in a dictatorship of the left or right. My takeaway is it gave me my faith in democracy. I have a friend of mine who is a Democratic candidate for the Senate in Texas. He was the commander of the International Space Station, spent 213 days in space looking down at 8 billion of us, with 6 colleagues up there floating above the earth. Asked him what his takeaway from the experience was, and it was the deep sense of connection that you can visibly see in the planet, which is a living organism and perfectly clear from space. And so I wonder with you, when you go deep into these stories, Kroberger, Epstein, what is your takeaway from this type of reporting at the
Well, I love what you just said. Everything is connected. Everything is connected, and that's why actually having conversations like this are always so important, because I get so in it. But in a sense, you do this because there is a bigger meaning that is important for people. Why do we read great literary fiction? Because in the end, we recognize something that in it about the particular that tells us something important about the universal. And so, I think the battle for the control of the narrative is an important theme to think about when thinking about Ghislaine Maxwell. I mean, to pull out from the day-to-day noise. And it's the same question about Brian Koberger. I will, the flip side of this is, and I've written about a lot of corrupt people over the decades at this point. But I will say this, the flip side of it all is that in most instances, there is a karmic circle that I have observed, that if people behave really badly, in the end, in most cases, I was at Vanity Fair for 14 years, I noticed this, in most cases it catches up to you, that most people who achieve great power and who use that power for ill, in most instances their bad behavior comes back to bite them. Not all. And obviously, the moment that we're living in right now is I think one of the things that's so unsettling about the moment that we live in is is that one's looking for, where is the karma right now? It's not readily apparent. But I think that one of the things that keeps me going is I do believe that in the end, people's actions catch up to them. So I may be naively optimistic and all around. Maybe, maybe I'll be, but I do think that.
Dr. King said the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Bob Marley said, never give up the fight. And that's good advice. Vicky Ward, you can find her, everybody, at Vicky Ward Investigates, one of the best, an investigative journalist, a truth seeker, author, along with James Patterson, of the new book, The Idaho Four, which goes deep into the terrible murders committed at the university in Moscow, Idaho, a bucolic college town, and one of the most beautiful corners of the country. Story of brutality and innocence lost, and so much more about what is happening in our country beneath the surface and above it. But Vicky, thank you so much for your time today. Really enjoyed the conversation and hope to see you again.
Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciated your thoughtful questions. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.